Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about scope 4 emissions, its significance, and how to measure scope 4 emissions, and strategies for reduction of scope 4 emissions. Before going into detail about scope 4 emissions, it's important that we learn what scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are. So, scope 1 refers to direct emissions that occur on site, such as fuel that is burned. It is considered direct emission. Scope 2 includes indirect emissions from purchased energy that is used on site, such as electricity and steam. Scope 3, on the other hand, covers all other indirect emissions, which can include tenant emissions and embodied carbon from building construction and the supply chain. Lastly, so we talk about what scope 4 emissions are. Scope 4 emissions are often referred to as avoided emissions. These include activities such as employees' transport, their commuting, their energy footprint, and wastage. These emissions are often challenging to track and report, as some reporting initiatives do not require organizations to report avoided emissions. However, Scope 4 emissions represent significant opportunities for real estate organizations to drive environmental progress and enhance the quality of life for tenants. So, although it is considered avoided emissions, why is it important? So, what is the significance of Scope 4 emissions? Talking about Scope 4 emissions is important because only then we can get a comprehensive view of all the emissions. We talked about direct emissions in Scope 1. We talked about indirect emissions in Scope 2, and we talked about all the other emissions in Scope 3. And Scope 4 is like emissions that organizations are not required to report on, but they are still um, uh, emissions that we need to mitigate. And talking about it is like a complete vision of, like, it's a complete view of all the emissions. And talking about this is also important because reporting on scope 4 emissions means that we have an enhanced corporate responsibility practices. We are taking into account all the aspects of our emissions, and we are trying to mitigate all the impact that our actions and our activities can have on the environment. As we talked previously, that it can allow real estate companies to provide unique and climate friendly solutions to their tenants and make their lives more sustainable. And this talking about scope 4 emissions allows us to develop sustainable products, because at the users ends we need to see that we're not only talking about energy transition, and we're not talking about renewable energies at the high scale. We need to talk about on ground and make people and these avoided emissions into accountability as well. It is also important to understand what activities are included in Scope 4 emissions. So, a list of them include tenant commuting emissions, business travel emissions, energy footprint of tenants or occupants, water usage and conservation, waste management and disposal, supply chain emissions, embodied carbon emissions from building materials, product life cycle emissions, land use and biodiversity, operational efficiency, and resource optimization. Here is a list of a few of these activities that are considered in the scope 4 emissions. Understanding them and keeping them into account allows us to build better services and build better products for our consumers. How do we measure scope 4 emissions? So there are various techniques out there developed by organizations in how we can take scope 4 emissions into account. And firstly, we need to analyze the life, to carry out a life cycle. We take into account the life cycle assessment of products and services. And the first step would be to measuring scope for emissions, done by analyzing the organization's operations and identifying areas where emissions can be avoided. Secondly, once we find out the sources of scope for emissions, uh, the next step is to determine the amount of avoided emissions. This can be done either using the techniques by the GIIN, which is one of the organizations that they have developed methodologies to measure scope 4 emissions. Their methodologies include attributional or consequential approaches, the details of which we will be find in our articles, which is published on our website. And lastly, the final step is to report the avoided emissions. This is typically done through sustainability reports or in accordance with reporting initiatives such as the CDP. If organizations are still not compliant with international sustainability standards, these standards provide a lot of detail in how to report your emissions, and organizations can mitigate their carbon footprint and reduce the carbon footprint and their emissions by following these international um, uh, reporting standards. So what are some of the strategies involved in reducing scope 4 emissions? All the other emissions, such as scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, are related to the industry and are related to organizations. So these the scope 4 is related to the activities of individuals, tenants, and employees. So the action also comes from the ground, and it includes like increase in energy efficiency, like our small habits of switching off the light for our energy usage and reduce our energy usage, increase energy efficiency. Whereas real estate companies can use sustainable material in building and in construction sector to reduce emissions at every cost, at every step. And lastly, I think it's important for consumers to have a change of behavior in the way they, in their daily lives, in their daily commute they're encouraged to use more sustainable practices and in sustainable modes of commute to reduce their emissions. Thank you so much. You can find more details about scope 4 emissions on our website. We talk about all the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, scope 4, all the emissions, and we talk about international sustainability standards, ESG standards, that apply to these emissions and how to adopt these policies. Thank you so much for listening.